Your muscle fibers have no ability to sense how heavy the object in your hand actually is. Inside the cell, nothing measures weight, and the number printed on a dumbbell never enters the fiber itself. Still, on the surface of that same fiber sits a protein system that decides, repetition after repetition, whether your body builds new muscle or allows existing muscle to gradually fade, which explains how someone like Daniel, who has followed the same trusted routine 3 times a week for years, can notice his arms slowly shrinking, while his neighbor Kareem, using only a resistance band at age 70, begins to regain visible muscle. It sounds unlikely until you understand what the fiber is truly detecting. You can sense the exact point where this detection occurs. Every set that stops before that point shares a clear pattern. The final repetition feels almost identical to the first. Steady, easy, predictable. Many people spend years training exactly like that, yet the fiber is waiting for something entirely different. It begins with structures that act like anchor bolts. Thousands of these are embedded across every muscle fiber, securing the cell to surrounding connective tissue and linking its internal machinery to the external world. Under light tension, each anchor holds firm. But when tension approaches the fiber's true limit, the anchor physically bends, and that bending becomes a signal. Scientists call these anchors integrins, and the deformation they experience under near-limit tension sends a chemical command inward. Deep inside the cell, that command reaches the main regulator of muscle growth, a control switch known as mTOR. This switch functions like a lock that requires 2 keys at the same time. One key is chemical, derived from the protein you consume. The other is mechanical, created only when tension nears the fiber's capacity. Using just one key does nothing, and many individuals in their later years have spent long periods unknowingly relying only on the chemical key. But what qualifies as near the limit is not fixed. Your body has been quietly adjusting that threshold over time. This shift explains why the same weight that helped you build muscle at 40 may no longer be effective at 65, and the full explanation leads to a surprising conclusion, that this critical boundary can be reached using nothing more than simple items already in your home. Everything begins with these anchors, so that is where the story starts. An integrin is a protein strand that passes directly through the outer membrane of the muscle fiber. Its outer end attaches to the collagen framework surrounding the fiber, while its inner end connects to the cell's internal skeleton. It is literally the connection point between your muscle and the external world, and like any structure under strain, it deforms before breaking. These anchors are arranged with remarkable precision along the fiber, forming repeating bands that secure the contractile machinery at regular intervals, effectively turning the entire cell into a distributed sensor of strain. When a fiber is under tension, the entire surface participates in sensing it simultaneously. There is no single measurement point. The whole cell acts as a gauge. At this moment, force transforms into information. Attached to the inner end of each anchor is an enzyme known as focal adhesion kinase. Think of it simply as a messenger at the anchor. When the anchor bends, this messenger also changes shape, activates, and begins a cascade of chemical signals that ultimately reach the growth switch. Mechanical tension becomes a molecular instruction. Engineers would recognize this system as a transducer, while biology refers to it as mechanotransduction, the way a cell, without senses like sight or hearing, interprets the external world through its own structure. Even everyday movements, like climbing stairs, are processed this way, with each step registering along the anchor lines of your muscles. This mechanism gives the cell a major advantage over chemistry alone: speed. While hormones take time to travel through the body, tension moves instantly through a connected structure, like a pull traveling along a rope. The moment the load approaches your limit, every anchor across the fiber detects it at once. The signal is immediate, accurate, and distributed everywhere. This process can even be observed in simple laboratory experiments. Muscle cells grown on flexible surfaces and stretched will activate the same messenger without any exercise or added nutrients. Pure strain, when strong enough, is enough to trigger the system. Setting the threshold this high follows a logical design. Building new muscle protein is extremely costly for the body, and if cells respond to every small effort, they would waste valuable resources. Instead, the trigger is set near the edge of capacity, where the structure is almost insufficient for the task. Only then does the fiber invest in growth, responding when the evidence clearly shows it is necessary. It is, in essence, a form of biological risk assessment carried out at the level of a single cell. So, there is no reward without clear evidence of a near-limit event. And the cost is real because muscle is constantly being broken down and rebuilt every hour of the day, whether you are training or resting. So every gram of muscle your body maintains comes with an ongoing energy expense. Every workout you have ever completed reached your muscle fibers in the same form, bending or the absence of bending, where force is converted into chemistry at that precise moment. So why did a weight that once created that bend suddenly stop working? Because the muscle you built adapted to it. The load that once challenged you in your 40s increased your capacity, and that capacity became the new reference point the anchors measure against. When the weight stays the same but your capacity increases, the tension moves further away from the critical edge over time. The anchors no longer bend. The messenger remains inactive. The growth switch stays off. Your consistency, over time, quietly reduces the strength of the signal. This kind of ceiling exists above every repeated activity. Even a daily walk reaches it after enough months, and a fixed set of weights reaches it in exactly the same way you may have experienced. The body categorizes anything repeated without change as routine, and routine is exactly what the system is designed to ignore. Here's a reality in its simplest form. Every session that made you stronger also made the next identical session less effective. Growth and silence were part of the same process, just seen from different angles. And the set that feels easy now feels that way because, at the level of the anchor, very little is happening. You have likely noticed this shift. The weight that once exhausted you now feels manageable, and that feeling can be mistaken for progress until physical results suggest otherwise. Most common reactions to a plateau actually make the situation worse. When progress stalls, people often add more volume. Extra sets, more sessions, longer workouts. But if each set ends far from the limit, it still registers as silence at the anchor. Repeated silence, no matter how consistent, remains silence. 10 easy sets produce the same signal as one easy set. The system measures closeness to the limit, and increasing volume does not change that variable. Adaptation, however, is only part of the reason for stagnation. The other part develops within the growth switch itself, influenced more by age than by training. What changes in a system that hasn't been directly altered? After about age 50, the switch begins to stiffen, and both of its inputs become less responsive. On the chemical side, the same amount of protein that once triggered a strong response now produces a smaller effect later in life, meaning your body requires more to achieve the same outcome. On the mechanical side, the requirement increases as well. Studies measuring muscle protein synthesis across different age groups show that older muscles produce a weaker response to the same exercise stimulus, as demonstrated by researchers like Arjun Mehta and colleagues in controlled physiological studies. Scientists refer to this combined effect as anabolic resistance. Both inputs still function, but each must be pushed further before any meaningful response occurs. This is not theoretical. It is directly measured. Researchers take small muscle samples before and after exercise and track protein production at the molecular level. The reduced response is visible, recorded, and consistently linked with aging. When these two changes combine, the outcome becomes clear. The training signal that once worked efficiently was calibrated for a younger system, while the threshold has steadily increased over time. Inside the body, the shift is subtle. Activities like gardening, walking, or light exercise that once maintained muscle at age 50 gradually fall below the required level, even though the effort feels the same. Muscle slowly declines, while the routine that once preserved it continues unchanged. You can remain disciplined, follow all the advice you were given, and still notice gradual changes in your physique. The guidance you follow was based on a system that responded more easily. Now, the standard has moved higher. This stiffening also explains a more difficult reality you may have observed in others: how quickly muscle can decline in older adults during periods of inactivity, such as illness or extended rest. Muscle breakdown continues at all ages, but rebuilding now requires a much stronger signal. When that signal disappears, the balance shifts rapidly in one direction. A week of inactivity can have a far greater impact on someone in their 70s than on someone much younger, because only one of them is dealing with a system that is harder to activate. This leads to the key question. If the threshold is now higher, what actually meets it? For a long time, the common belief was simply to lift heavier weights. But for many individuals past 60, that approach runs into physical limitations, especially joint stress, which is why so many quietly assume progress is no longer possible. Exercise scientists have wrestled with this challenge as well, because the obvious solution, simply increasing load, does not always remain practical or safe. Experiment had a gap in its design. Light and heavy loads had never truly been tested under equal conditions. Then clarity came from studies that directly compared the two. One group trained with heavier weights, close to 80% of their maximum, performing 6 to 8 repetitions. Another group used lighter loads, around 30% to 40%, completing 25 to 30 repetitions. Both groups continued until they reached a point where another clean repetition was no longer possible. When researchers later measured muscle growth through imaging, both groups showed nearly identical increases in muscle size. This outcome, demonstrated by researchers like Daniel Morton and his team in the Journal of Applied Physiology, has since been confirmed in multiple studies. There is an important detail, though. Maximum strength, the single heaviest lift a person can perform, still improves more with heavy training, because strength at that level also depends on the nervous system's efficiency. But when it comes to muscle size, the tissue itself grows in much the same way. This finding applies directly to you. While these results were first observed in younger individuals, the same principle holds in older muscle, though with a smaller margin for error. Because the growth system becomes less responsive with age, lighter loads must be taken closer to true failure to produce the same effect as heavier ones. The requirement at the boundary becomes stricter. When you view both methods through the lens of the anchor system, the result makes sense. The anchors measure how close tension is to the fiber's limit. A light resistance band taken to true failure and a heavy weight taken to true failure both reach the same point, zero distance from that limit. The bending signal is identical, regardless of what created it. An internal messenger transmits it without concern for the equipment used. True failure has a specific definition worth understanding. It is a moment when movement slows noticeably, and another clean repetition is no longer possible despite full effort. Stopping at mild discomfort, where many people end their sets, is far from this point. Discomfort is subjective. Failure is measurable. So, what makes the final repetitions fundamentally different from the earlier ones? Your nervous system organizes effort like a well-managed team. For easier tasks, it relies on smaller, fatigue-resistant muscle fibers first. As the demand increases, it gradually recruits larger and more powerful fibers. The largest of these, known as type 2 fibers, are only activated when the smaller ones are exhausted. This order, known as the size principle, is fixed. If you follow a light set through this process, you can see how it unfolds. The early repetitions are handled entirely by smaller fibers, which is why they feel easy. As those fibers tire, chemical byproducts accumulate, reducing their output. The effort required to move the same load increases. Larger fibers begin to join in, one layer at a time, until by the final repetitions, the one slight resistance feels like a maximum challenge. The burning sensation you may have avoided is simply the buildup of these byproducts, signaling that the workload is shifting. The resistance itself has not changed. The system responding to it has. This also explains a pattern you may recognize. When your final repetition feels just as easy as the first, it means only the smaller fibers were used. The larger fibers, which are most affected by aging, were never recruited. These are the fibers responsible for powerful movements. Standing up quickly, catching yourself when you stumble, or opening a tight lid. The strength that supports independence depends on fibers that easy sets never activate. When a set is carried to true failure, the situation reverses. The smaller fibers fatigue completely, and the nervous system is forced to call on the larger reserves. In those final attempts, the type 2 fibers, the ones most at risk of decline, are finally engaged. The shaking, the burning, and the slowing movement in those last repetitions are signs that all available fibers are working. It may feel like the set is breaking down, But in reality, it is the only phase where the deepest muscle fibers are fully involved. There's also an important nuance. The very last repetition carries the most value, but the one or two just before are nearly as effective, because by then the full range of fibers is already engaged. What the system cannot respond to is stopping too early, ending a set while several comfortable repetitions remain. Many people have spent years training this way. Once you understand that the fiber responds to how close you are to its limit, those final repetitions become the most important part of any set. You now understand what drives muscle growth after 60. Tension brought to the true limit of what the fiber can handle, regardless of the tool used. At this point, the focus shifts from what the fiber detects to what happens internally after that signal is received. Growth requires more than a signal. It needs a workforce to carry it out, and that workforce is exactly what aging gradually reduces. A muscle fiber is one of the largest cells in the body, essentially a long cable of contracting proteins that can extend several centimeters. Managing something of that scale cannot be done from a single control point, so the fiber relies on distributed systems throughout its structure, hundreds of nuclei arranged along its length, each responsible for managing its own section, producing the instructions needed to build and maintain the proteins within that area. Scientists refer to each of these sections as a myonuclear domain. Imagine a caretaker responsible for a specific piece of land. Maintenance is constant because the cost of upkeep never stops. Muscle proteins wear out and are continuously replaced, and every replacement depends on instructions issued by a nucleus. Areas close to their caretaker are maintained efficiently, while regions farther away, when stretched too thin, begin to weaken before they visibly shrink. Growth depends on the ability to bring in more caretakers. These new contributors come from satellite cells, specialized stem cells that rest along the outer surface of the muscle fiber, positioned between the membrane and the surrounding collagen layer, right near the anchor points that detect strain. Their location is critical. The small space where a satellite cell rests changes shape whenever the muscle fiber beneath it is stressed. So even without directly sensing your workout, the satellite cell is activated by the physical deformation caused by tension. When the signal occurs repeatedly over time, these cells respond. They divide, and some merge into the muscle fiber, adding their nuclei and becoming permanent contributors to the system. This merging process is irreversible. Once a satellite cell fuses with a fiber, it gives up its independence and commits entirely to maintaining that structure. This is a long-term investment. Within your muscles today are nuclei that joined years ago, still functioning, still producing the instructions needed to maintain the tissue they became part of long ago. Each new nucleus increases the muscle capacity to grow and maintain itself, because there is a limit to how much each one can manage. Beyond a certain point, further growth depends on increasing this workforce. The signal initiates growth, but the workforce determines how much growth is possible. Aging affects this system in two ways. First, the number of available satellite cells declines over time. Second, those that remain become less responsive, requiring stronger and more consistent signals to activate. Research on older adults undergoing resistance training shows that those who gained muscle were also the ones whose satellite cell activity increased, as observed in studies such as those conducted by Marcus Petrelli and colleagues. The workforce responds not to occasional effort, but to a consistent pattern of demand. In successful cases, the stimulus was applied several times per week over extended periods, forming a steady pattern rather than isolated bursts of effort. A single intense workout is often ignored, while consistent training over months is recognized as a lasting requirement. At this stage, the second key introduced earlier becomes important again. The growth triggered by near-limit tension requires materials to support it. This is where nutrition, particularly protein intake, plays its role. The timing matters most after the mechanical signal has been delivered. A system that may respond weakly under normal conditions becomes more receptive after the anchors have been activated, which is why protein consumed after a demanding session has a greater impact than the same meal consumed during inactivity. The two keys, mechanical tension and nutritional input, work in sequence. Without the signal, the system remains inactive. Without the material, growth cannot proceed. The visible loss of muscle over time also has a clear explanation at the cellular level. When the signal is absent for extended periods, nuclei are gradually lost without replacement. The remaining nuclei are forced to manage larger areas, and eventually the muscle reduces its size to match the available workforce. What appears as shrinking muscle is, in effect, a reduction in managed territory. Other factors also contribute, including slower protein production, reduced neural input, and hormonal changes. But the signal you provide through training directly influences this process. There is, however, a hopeful aspect. Studies in animal models show that nuclei gained during periods of training can remain even after muscle size decreases, allowing for faster regrowth when training resumes. Observations in humans suggest a similar pattern, although research is still ongoing. This implies that gains made later in life may not be entirely lost during periods of inactivity, but instead remain as a form of stored capacity. In this sense, the body retains a memory of past effort. Muscle does more than enable movement. It plays a major role in regulating blood sugar, acting as a primary site where glucose is absorbed from the bloodstream during contraction. As muscle mass declines, this capacity is reduced, meaning the body becomes less efficient at managing blood sugar levels after meals. The glucose that remains in circulation for longer periods after lunch in your 60s is partly this, a clearinghouse losing usable space, and every section of muscle that is given up reduces another place where nutrients can be stored and managed. So the system depends on receiving a strong signal on a regular schedule, a signal that must cross a higher threshold in the body, whose joints are increasingly less willing to tolerate heavy external loads, what creates near-limit tension without a rack of weights or a gym. The anchors respond to physics, and physics provides tools that standard gym numbers often ignore. The first tool is time. A load lowered over 4 slow seconds keeps the anchors under tension for the entire descent. If the same load is dropped in a single second, the anchors only experience a brief moment of stress. Like a long camera exposure capturing more light, slow movement captures more mechanical signal. Total time under tension becomes part of the message reaching the growth system. The lowering phase is especially important because resisting a load while lengthening produces higher internal tension than it feels like externally. That means the downward phase of any movement is often where even a light object comes closest to the fiber's limit. Fast descents waste this opportunity. From a scientific standpoint, one thing is clear. Heavy and light loads can produce similar results when taken to true failure, while the exact effect of slow tempo is still being refined by ongoing research. The second tool is simple division. Any object handled with one arm instead of two immediately increases relative demand. A suitcase, a water jug, or a grocery bag carried in one hand can approach the capacity of that single limb far more closely than the same load shared across both sides. In this way, everyday objects become meaningful resistance simply by reducing mechanical distribution. The household already contains everything required. The key is how it is carried. The third tool is position. Every movement has a point where mechanical demand peaks. The lowest point of the stand, the midpoint of the curl, or the bottom of a carry where the arm hangs fully extended. Holding a load at these points turns movement into sustained strain. As long as the position is held, the internal signal remains active. A static hold can therefore produce the same type of mechanical message as a full repetition, provided it is challenging enough. When these three tools are combined, traditional equipment becomes less important. A light object moves slowly, paused at its hardest point, and taken close to failure, can create the same biological signal as a heavier load lifted quickly. The anchors do not recognize equipment. They recognize deformation and distance from the fiber's limit. Rubber bands, bodyweight movements, and household items all speak the same mechanical language when applied correctly. The joint, however, do notice the difference. Aging connective tissue tends to tolerate slow, controlled, lower load stress far better than fast, high-impact loading. In that sense, the safer method often aligns with the more effective one, that you will recognize when the signal is finally being reached. The familiar comfort of earlier training disappears. The last repetition no longer feels like the first. It slows, it strains, and it demands attention. That change is the moment mechanical bending is actually occurring, and it is more reliable than any external number attached to the weight. There is an important safety note alongside all of this. Training that approaches failure can temporarily raise blood pressure and place stress on joints and tendons. Anyone with cardiovascular conditions, uncontrolled hypertension, or recent injury should involve a medical professional before attempting high-effort training. Point 1 timeline matters here. Early progress is mostly neurological. The body becomes more efficient at recruiting existing fibers. This happens quickly. True physical growth, involving new protein and structural change, unfolds slowly over months. During that period, much of what improves is invisible, even though the underlying system is already adapting. Every training session ultimately ends at a boundary, and that boundary carries information. Years of comfortable sets communicated a consistent message. The system was never pushed close to its limit. The anchors recorded exactly that distance every time. Now the goal changes. Somewhere in daily life sits an object light enough to seem insignificant but heavy enough, when used deliberately, to bring the system to that honest boundary. The stimulus does not depend on the gym. It depends on reaching the point where the fiber is truly challenged. The load is just a carrier. The real message has always been the same: how close you came to the limit, and whether the system ever had to respond.